Welcome to TeamTalk from TeamKinetic with me, Chris Martin.
And me, Imo Greatbatch. TeamTalk is the podcast that dives deeper into the world of volunteer management and getting to know the people who help make volunteering happen, why they do it, how they do it, and what they want to see change. Welcome back for season 3 of our little pod, where we're going to get into some thinking around the vision for volunteering, themes, speak to a range of experts who can help us understand where volunteering is now and where we want to be over the next 10 years.
This week we're joined by a guest who many of you may already know, and I know he won't mind me saying he's seen more of the volunteer sector than most. And this yesterday he's celebrating his 29th year of working in volunteering.
So, Rob Jackson, welcome to Team Talk and happy 29th anniversary.
Thank you. I'm not sure my receding hairline appreciates the 29 years, but I appreciate the good wishes. Thank you.
Well, you don't look a day over 29. So.
I'll pay you later.
I did have a little look online what 29 years represents. Any guesses?
No, fail.
So you can't shake your head on a podcast, right?
I know. No idea, Chris.
Garnet. And exploring a little deeper, this stone represents revitalisation, purification, and balances energy, brings serenity, passion, and we think, it suits you well, that, Rob. I think it's a stone that couldn't be a more appropriate description for you in the voluntary sector.
Bringing serenity. I'm not quite sure about that one, but certainly passion and commitment. I'll go with that for definite, yeah.
That's quite a nice description, though,
It is a nice description. There's definitely things I'd like to aspire to.
Well, and we're in a little pod house today, aren't we? Usually we're on Zoom, and the three of us are in a room together. You can't see us, but hopefully it sounds nice and clear. But part of this pod, Rob, is an opportunity for the audience to get to know you as a guest a little bit better. And although Chris has said you've been a fixture in the sector, I don't like the word fixture. You've been of influential role within the sector for some time. People may not appreciate your journey, and there may be some listeners who may be from the more traditional parts of the volunteer sector or may not be aware of your work. So we'd love to spend the first part of our chat talking about you, the things that make you tick, what gets you excited, your career to date, and how you found yourself working in this strange world we called volunteer management.
Yeah, that's fine. I like talking about myself. That's good.
Great stuff. I think most people who've come across one of your blogs, or maybe they've attended a session you've run at one of the sector events, or maybe they've signed up to something like Volunteer Voice or your 200-word Tuesday. So, you've got plenty of content out there where people may have bumped into you. But I've got to know you as the straight-talking consultant with some pretty strong opinions about the state of the sector currently. But we'll come back to those a little bit later.
Okay.
But I'd like to start with you, sort of your professional journey, as a volunteer manager. I saw we do some research for this show, and I saw from that research that you started, in physics and acoustics, which may not be the most traditional journey into volunteer management. I feel like it could be a podcast all of its own.
Yeah, probably.
In all honesty. So how does a boy from Manchester end up working in this particular space?
Well, you would have thought as well, if I'd done acoustics, I'd have known how to set all the IT up to get this podcast going well.
Yeah.
So I did physics with modern acoustics at university for 2 years. So even most listeners will realise that means I did not finish my degree. Because it was a subject that really interested me at school. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was quite a fascinating topic. I still think a lot of that kind of stuff's quite interesting. And I've always been a fan of music. I've always loved music as well. So I thought it might be quite a nice interface between the two. Let's just say the reality didn't match the expectation.
Okay.
But I had a really good time at university. I absolutely loved university, and but my grades didn't bear that out. So when I got to the end of my second year, I was in a position where at that point you had to do a placement year. You had to do a placement year in your subject. And with my grades, it was nigh on impossible to find anything. I mean, nobody's going to hire you with those low grades. So I ended up getting a job at the university, actually, managing what was then called a student tutoring and mentoring program. So basically volunteer management, but I had no idea what volunteer management was. So you're recruiting mainly undergraduates to be classroom assistants, mentors in local schools, kind of raising aspirations towards higher education.
Yep.
6 months into that, just thought, I've enjoyed this more than the last 2 years of my studies. I find it really fulfilling and really rewarding. So I decided, right, that was it. I was going to drop out and I was going to keep doing that job. Did it for a year. Went and got another job shortly afterwards with the Students' Union, running a volunteer-led advice service. So the advice service had paid staff, of which I was one, but we also had students recruited. So it was like peer support and advice.
Yep.
Moved up to London, went for a job with Bernardo's, got that, supporting volunteer engagement across children's services, London, East Anglia and the South East. Went from there to RNIB, did 6 years on supporting volunteer fundraising nationally. Went to Volunteering England, did 6 years there. So there's a 6 year theme
here. Yeah, I was going to say.
2 years, 6 years, 6 years. Ended my time there as Director of Development and Innovation. With the change of government in 2010, long story short, funding cuts.
Okay.
We took the decision as an organisation that we couldn't make most of the staff redundant and leave a senior management team in place. So we cut the senior management team. So I went out on my own. So since 2011, I've been a freelancer. So I talk about doing 4 things. Writing, so I've written a couple of books, do all the blogging you were talking about, Chris.
Yep.
I do speaking at events, I do training, and I also do consulting. And that's for clients, large and small, right across the UK. But I've also got a client base on the continent and in Australia, New Zealand, the US and Canada as well.
Oh, that's a pretty impressive journey through volunteering. But quite interested to unpick that not finding something immediately must have been a bit low on the morale, and kind of you talked a little bit about the grades and then you not being able to get things. How did that build your resilience in the sector and kind of from working in volunteering?
Yeah, I suppose that experience probably wasn't the defining one. The defining one was when I left Volunteering England, because I'd found I sheer blind luck. Every job I'd ever gone for, I got.
It's a nice problem to have.
It's a lovely problem to have.
Yeah.
And you when you suddenly find yourself not getting those jobs, you begin to question: is there something wrong with me?
Yeah.
Is it now? I went for a job. I won't tell you which organisation, but when I knew I was being made redundant from Volunteering England, and I didn't get that job, and I spent 2-3 weeks over Christmas being pretty miserable.
Yeah.
And then the moment I decided in the new year I was going to go freelance and started to tell some people,
Okay.
work started to come in.
Oh, wow.
And,
Give you the confidence back again that, okay, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a timing thing.
Yep.
Maybe the universe was conspiring on my behalf or
Yep.
something like that. But I'd known consultants, so the idea of going down this particular kind of work was always at the back of my mind. But that, I suppose, in terms of your resilience question, Imo, it was that sense of actually this is steering me to do the right kind of thing. My mum was definitely not a religious person, but she was always of the opinion that the right thing comes along at the right time.
Yeah.
You've just got to have the patience.
You've
for
got to be
it.
open to the opportunity once it pops
open
up.
to the universe.
Yeah.
So I think that was just the universe, whatever you want to think's way of telling me this was the time to go do it. But then working 12 years as a freelancer through 2 of the worst economic crises that we've had definitely teaches you resilience. When you start your new financial year on the 1st of April, in a normal job, you look at your budget and go, I've got money. As a freelancer, you go, I have no money other than outgoings. So it's a different perspective.
But it's an amazing leap to make anyway. So it's been something of a pattern of the guests that we've spoke to that over the 3 seasons, they don't genuinely have a traditional volunteer background. You fell into it through kind of university and that side of things. Be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And as a sector, there isn't a set career path.
No.
Is that changing a little? Do you think it's a problem in a world where, there's such professional standards? Should there be a career path for volunteer managers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's about a million different ways of answering it. And I'll start by saying I think the fact that people come to this from so many different backgrounds and experiences is a real asset. I mean, the most left field one I can think of is a fantastic guy in the States called Jerome Tennille, who does absolutely brilliant work, who came to this from working in military intelligence from the
Wow.
US Navy.
Love it.
You know, I've not really come across anybody else that's come into the sector from kind of what you would expect as being completely left field, and he's fantastic, absolutely fantastic guy. So I think that diversity and that breadth of experience is a real asset for us.
Yeah.
Because particularly when we get together online, or particularly when we get together at conferences, you've got so many different perspectives coming at this one topic that people tend to be quite passionate about.
And the topic is so broad.
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
of itself.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm a big fan of Matthew Syed's book, Rebel Ideas, which is all about diversity in thinking and diversity in organisations and how that really adds value. So I think that's a real asset for us. I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where people go, Mum, Dad, when I grow up, I want to be a volunteer manager. I mean, my 7-year-old said that to me, but that was only because he knew I was a volunteer manager.
Okay.
And I did work with somebody in Belfast last week who had quite an early positive experience of volunteering and thought that's the kind of road that I want to go down. Is it a barrier that we don't have qualifications? I don't know.
For me, it's not so much qualifications as core competencies.
Yeah.
That we talked before the pod today about getting volunteering more recognised at board level, and things like that.
Yeah.
And I feel that if volunteer management of itself was held in higher esteem in the organisation, and was held at an equivalent professional standard as HR, maybe, that maybe that would change some of these. I don't know, but you know, this idea that anybody can be a volunteer manager is probably true, because it's really about the personal skills and the organisational skills coming together in a sort of nice union. But it does feel like there is some core competencies there that could be codified a little bit more.
Well, and I guess interestingly, we're quite UK based, or do go international, but you've got a lot of colleagues across the globe. On Chris's point about core competencies, the trend of what you've seen in those who are really, really brilliant at what they do, what sort of 3 to 5 themes of competencies would you say you'd seen in them?
It's a really good question. I mean, there are core competencies out there. Let me start by saying that. So probably the most well-established is the work that the Council for Certification on Volunteer Administration in the States does. So they have the CVA qualification. It's a rigorous process that you have to go through to study for that, take an exam, get that. You then have to reaccredit every 5 years. It is predominantly North American. There are people in the UK who have it. There are people around the world who have it. They do have a kind of an ethical position statement on volunteer engagement. They do talk about core competencies in there as well. And they are growing, I think, in awareness. If you are in the US, my experience is you are at a disadvantage in the job market as a volunteer manager if you do not have CVA after your name. Okay. So I think in that sense, I agree with you that having something would be useful. I was involved in the first group that ever developed the National Vocational Qualification in Volunteer Management here in the UK, or at least in England. And I think where I find it kind of slightly difficult to answer the question is from two perspectives. Most of what was assessed by the MVQ was the process side of volunteer management.
Yeah.
Can you write a policy? Can you do a risk assessment? Which is really, really important part, and people need to be able to know that kind of stuff.
And that's often the nature of an MVQ more than anything else, rather than necessarily...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Does it make a great volunteer engagement professional?
Not necessarily.
Not on its own.
Yeah.
I've asked that question countless times over the years. What makes somebody a really great volunteer engagement professional? And I've never got a really consistent answer. I think for me, it's a marrying of that system process stuff, but it's also about being able to engage with people.
Yep.
It's about that interpersonal skills. It's about relating to people. It's about influencing people. So those recalcitrant staff who don't want to work with volunteers, influencing senior managers, influencing decision makers to think about volunteers. So there's 3 straight off the bat. In terms of a career path, it's one of the questions that I ask in one of the workshops I do, kind of where do you come from into this? Because I agree most people kind of fall into it by accident. But also where does success look? What does success look like? So is success, head of volunteering in a national organisation? Is success becoming a consultant. I don't think it's down to the job that we do. I think success, if we're doing well as a profession, and we can get into the whole what is and what isn't
And
a
we
profession, we might, is when you get to wherever you get to, are you playing a positive and supportive role around volunteering? So if success for you is becoming a chief exec, then you have a background in volunteer management, then woe betide you if you are a chief exec who does not support investment in effective volunteer engagement. And more of us almost could be aspiring to that. So, yeah.
I'd be interested. I mean, it's not that when you just pose that question, I wonder how many of the bigger charities, their chief exec come from the volunteering part of the organisation. I don't know if anyone's got any stats on that.
Or even flip it, how many of them actually volunteer and have kind of that experience of, because we've interchanged already with the term of volunteer management.
Absolutely.
And I can hear you self-corrected yourself to volunteer engagement professional. And there's, volunteer involvement as well. We've talked about VIPs. And I guess what's the shift in the profession of the terminology? Is it because, volunteers don't like the sense of being managed, or volunteer managers don't like the sense of managing people? Kind of, what do you think the shift in terminology across the sector is?
So I think I think increasingly the established term is volunteer engagement professionals, and I think that marks people out as people who are in this as a profession. This is their job, rather than the tens of thousands of people across the public, private and voluntary sectors who work with volunteers but would never see themselves as a volunteer manager. Okay. They're a community fundraiser, they're an office manager, they're a curator.
They're a chair of a sports club.
Whatever it may be. So I think increasingly we're moving to that volunteer engagement, and I think the reason why the engagement's important is because we've gone from being administrators, coordinators to managers. Leaders kind of is parallel with managers, but it's
just hierarchy as well.
But this, and we'll get onto it when we talk about some of the research that's around at the moment, engaging people to get a really good experience in volunteering is the core of what we do. Mm-hmm. So engagement also, to me, and it links to the vision, is about equal partners. This isn't just about you come in and we manage you as a free labour. For those that can't see, I'm inverted commas with my fingers. The free labour side of things. Yeah. And I don't think, in terms of your question, Chris, I don't have a universal knowledge of every charity chief exec in the country. But I think for me, the indicator is that very few of the courses in non-profit management that exist, the postgrad master's courses, spend any substantive time teaching people about volunteering. Bayes Business School do, largely because Justin Davis-Smith, who used to be chief exec at Volunteering England, used to be my boss, is there, and he's made that a key part of their platform. But my understanding is you can go on a lot of these non-profit management courses and you can learn about charity accounting and how you handle that and how you do HR and all of these kinds of things. And the only time volunteers will ever get talked about is to do with the board, and the V word won't get used.
That's interesting. I had a conversation with some professors that do organisation management, and they were saying that very little effort is put into helping anybody in business understand the value of things that isn't monetary.
Yes.
And it's a similar kind of thing, I think. We're in that sort of same kind of space of they're kind of difficult things to teach, if that makes sense. So they don't sit within the normal paradigm.
Totally. And we're obsessed in our sector with cost.
Yeah.
The voluntary sector
not
is
value,
cost of everything, value of nothing.
Yes.
But and this is the bit that really sort of frustrates me in regards to, well, actually, if you do want to look at cost, and we're in a social action world, and there's a sort of social return on investment, and if you look at the well-being implications, the Hidden Diamonds report from years and years ago, and actually the benefits of volunteering, health, physical well-being, and the reduction in costs in hospital costs because people are giving, they feel, why aren't we pushing that kind of more for the sector? Is that better education of the professionals within it, or?
I think it's because Sue Carter-Carl in the States does a load of really, really good stuff, and her Volunteer Commons blog is well worth going and checking out. She's probably the kind of lead. She was on my podcast. She's probably the leading person when she's talking
there's
about
other
this.
podcasts about volunteering.
I know.
I know.
There are more advanced ones advancing the profession, right?
Sorry. But she talks about it as, you've got bodies like the International Labour Organization. So the International Labour Organization's defined way of measuring volunteering is wage
unit.
replacement model.
Yeah.
How many hours timed by minimum wage or equivalent thing. When you've got big international bodies like that who push that agenda forward, and they do it because it's easy to measure, not because it's the best thing to measure, then that leads to everybody else doing the same thing. Andy Haldane, now in charge at RSA, was chief economist at the Bank of England, did a speech.
I'm going to try and get him on the podcast.
Good. He did a speech in 2014 from his experience of setting up pro bono economics, which was about measuring the economic, personal and social value of volunteering. So exactly what you're saying, Emma, if through social prescribing, we know that we can reduce the demand on a GP surgery by 50% because the issue is loneliness and having somebody to talk to, we can measure that, and that's a value that's volunteering has delivered that is not the equivalent of if we paid people to do this work, which we never would because it would cost us too much money, this is what it would cost us, which is a stupid argument.
I also think as well, when you're into the measuring the intangible cost values of these things, the sector has been a victim of its own poor processes in doing that in the past, and it's made people question the values that are sometimes ascribed to some of these things. So the work you mentioned for Andy Haldane and the join-in work that was similar, came out at a similar time, they suggested that sports volunteering had a value of 50 billion. Andy Haldane suggested the volunteering sector had a value of 200 billion, which puts it on a par with oil. And people look at that and they go, it starts a conversation. It's an interesting conversation. But as a politician, you can't take that 200 billion to the bank and do something with it. So it's a challenging piece of messaging to get right, that people believe it.
It is, but it's also about the way that we value things as a society. So it's not just the sector's fault. So Scotland, New Zealand are both looking for it. I think Iceland as well are both looking at how you measure national success in terms of a well-being economy rather than an economy.
Yes.
So GDP does not become your core measure. So I can't remember, it may have been Andy Haldane who said it, that we don't count volunteering in our GDP, but we count organised crime.
It's the donut economics approach where, inputs and outputs, they're not necessarily all financial.
So I think if we got to more of a kind of well-being economy, then I think volunteering suddenly jumps up the agenda for people.
Well, and looping back to where you started talking about the experience is really important of the volunteers and ensuring that's in place. Well, actually, if we think back to events like the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, the experience of those attending the Commonwealth Games is absolutely brilliant when they've had that welcoming, cheering kind of volunteer that's guided them where they are at the Commonwealth Games. And the impact of volunteers enjoying their experience on others' experience is through the roof.
Absolutely. And I think there's the other element to this as well, and it comes back to that kind of how an organisation sees it. So if your job is like a Barnardo's or something like that, you're there supporting vulnerable children, vulnerable adults, whoever, that's your kind of core mission. That's what you're there to do. So you think of volunteers as a way of bringing in people to work as part of a wider team with paid staff to deliver that service. You maybe don't immediately approach it from the perspective of the very act of involving volunteers has a knock-on effect on the health and well-being of those volunteers, and therefore that's a form of service delivery. So if we look at it just in this kind of one-dimensional almost way of thinking about a charity or a non-profit, and this is why one of the themes that I come back to a lot is I think a lot of volunteer managers get this. I think most of the people who are probably listening to this understand a lot of this kind of stuff, or aware a lot, appreciate it, value it. The point is not about preaching to that choir because they get it. It's preaching to the politicians, the chief execs, the boards, the people who don't necessarily see this, getting it on the curriculum for non-profit management courses, so that people see that broader benefit. And British Heart Foundation just published a great report recently, and they were talking about the kind of undervalue of volunteering within social prescribing. We know volunteering can be a really great piece of social prescribing, but it's just not recognised highly enough.
We'll pop a link into that particular piece of work. But you're right, it's often at board level, and we've had personal experience of this as a company, volunteering is often seen as risk and not seen as value to the same extent.
And that comes, in my experience, from... The only way I can phrase it is prejudice and stereotype. So it's because you're not paid as a volunteer, you are inherently untrustworthy, unreliable, and incompetent. I mean, if you've worked with a member of staff who broke confidentiality, you would never go, all employees are going to break confidentiality. But loads of people will work with a volunteer who breaks confidentiality and will say volunteers should never be allowed near confidential information ever again. And one of the things it's a mantra that I talk about over and over and over again. Pay does not equal competence. There are some incredibly well-paid people in the world who are terrible at what they do, and there are millions of people who get paid nothing who are superb at what they do.
And I was waiting for the opinions to start. Here we go. Brilliant.
But do you think, so it feels like, from what I'm observing in sport and through broader organisations, organisations are moving more from outcome-driven strategy to purpose-driven strategy, and we know that cause is very important to volunteers. Do you think that could have a positive impact from the leadership point of view?
Potentially.
Yeah, I think it absolutely could do. And you're right, we know lots of volunteers are motivated by cause-driven agendas. We know there's research in the States that says that's true of millennials. There's relatively recent research out. I think British Heart Foundation mentioned it, the study I just referenced about people over the age of 55 as well. I think the thing with cause-driven is it has a knock-on impact for organisations, which is the moment we talk about cause, what we're saying is, I'm passionate, for example, about the climate agenda. I don't care if that's Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace.
It's a pretty broad church.
I want to fight the climate agenda. I want to work for that. That then means if I don't care which organisation I do, we have to stop being so precious about are they our volunteers and how do we work together to make sure that people are pushing in the right direction. So that's where I think it has a really practical leadership implication, because we have to take a step back and go, actually, if I don't have enough volunteers, it doesn't matter so long as the bigger cause has got enough.
Well, and it's funny that, because it could be like one of 5 themes, collaboration and a vision for volunteering.
Yeah, it sounds like a good idea, doesn't it?
I often think
it's almost like we'd spoken about this before today.
For me as well, there's if you took that to the commercial world and you were working on a product in that setting, you would look at your competitors, you would look at your people that offer similar things to you, and you would be looking at that as a market, as opposed to them being my volunteers.
Yeah,
and you'd be developing that market. And you'd sometimes develop that market with your competitors, because a bigger market for one of you is a bigger market for all of you.
But this is where I think we get hung up on it, though, because even still in the talk of volunteer passports and volunteer sharing, we talk about the fact that we're in competition as volunteer involving organisations with each other. We're not at all. What we're in competition with is anything that people can spend their spare time doing.
Exactly.
So when you look at time well spent, when you look at Community Life Survey, about a quarter to a third of people say they volunteer because they've got time. The objection is not I don't have time, it's I have other things to do with my spare time.
Yes.
I want to prioritise my spare time doing things other than volunteering. And that's probably got more acute for people after we've been through a year and 18 months of not being allowed to go out and do the things that we normally do.
Yeah.
So our competition, it's one of the things I say when I'm working with organisations, is your competition is not the charity shop down the road, it's not the sports group round the corner. Your competition is anything your volunteers can spend their spare time doing. So I worked with an organisation not that long ago who changed the shift patterns for their volunteers after the first 2 lockdowns. So their volunteers were mainly retired. They were mainly coming in, working outdoors, and they were working from 10 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon.
Okay.
Pre-COVID, that was the shift pattern.
Yep.
Okay. When they came back after COVID, that shift pattern got moved from 11 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, and they lost volunteers. The reason they lost volunteers was because those volunteers had other things to do with their spare time, which was picking their grandkids up at school.
Yeah.
And guess what? Their grandkids were more important to them than their volunteering.
Yeah.
What a surprise.
So if we don't, they weren't going and volunteering for another group.
Yep.
It was, we hadn't designed it right
Yeah.
around that group. We hadn't understood what else was drawing on their time. So I think if we get out of that, British Heart Foundation are in competition with Cancer Research UK or in competition with British Red Cross, we open up loads of collaborative possibilities.
But I think that's where volunteer engagement professionals are very good,
Yeah.
and there is a lot of appetite to collaborate, and particularly in sport as well. I do think within kind of like teams, there's an appetite to
I think it's the structure of the sector makes it quite difficult, and the infrastructure that's available to do the collaboration is quite limited. So you can not compete with your nearest rival. You don't compete with volleyball for volunteers, for example. But there's also no real way for you to share volunteers.
But I think
in a straightforward way.
Volunteer engagement, I agree with you, Emma. I think volunteer engagement professionals do get that. And I think that's because a lot of them realise that the people who volunteer with their organisations don't just volunteer with one organisation.
Yeah.
They volunteer elsewhere as well. But you see it even within an organisation where it's competition between the volunteers and the donors. So we know from the research that's out there, volunteers make more generous donors than non-volunteers.
Yeah.
Yet either rarely do we ask volunteers to become financial donors,
or
do we do it in an appropriate way? And
Yeah.
I've got some blank looks in the last 9 months when I've said to organisations, you've probably got donors who are stopping giving at the moment because of the cost of living crisis. Has your fundraising team asked them if they'd like to volunteer instead? And there's a look of confusion mixed with panic, mixed with what is this weird thing this guy's talking about? So it's even within organisations. So it comes back again. I think the volunteer engagement professional gets it. It's the wider audience. Do they get it?
And what needs to change to help them get it?
I think some of it's the language. I think we just stop talking about our volunteers. I mean, Carl Wilding used that. He would say it's not original to him, but he used that brilliant line at a conference a few years ago. They're not your volunteers, you are their organisation. So it's that mindset shift. It's about changing people's understanding. And when I say people, I'm meaning the people who kind of hold some of the strategic responsibility but aren't volunteer engagement professionals, boards, senior leadership teams, chief. It's easy to say it's all of them. It's not all of them. Some of them are really switched on. Helping them to understand that, volunteers today aren't Ethel, aged 80, who's going to step forward and give you 2 days a week until she's 105. And by the way, she volunteers 25 hours a day, 8 days a week with 300 organisations in the local community already. Volunteering's different from that. And we've got loads of research that unpicks that. And I think it's this mindset of possessiveness and control, and as you said, Chris, risk.
Yep.
That if it's just about doing something different. And I get that, particularly for a lot of organisations at the moment. It's hard. Money's tight. Future's uncertain. It's scary times for people doing something different. But one of the things that I remain, and I've said this quite a lot on my blog, and I say it quite a lot in the speaking that I do, that fills me with great optimism at the moment, is that it's when you get in really difficult times like this that the really innovative and creative solutions come out. And I wouldn't wish what we're going through as a country, and some of the people in this country are going through things far worse than I am. Wouldn't wish that on anybody. But I think we're going to get some really creative solutions around volunteering in the future out of it. And I'm quite excited by that.
Yeah, the market sort of will demand it.
Yeah.
And whilst we're talking about the interesting times that we're going through at the moment, we don't tend to discuss politics with our guests.
It's normally not something you discuss. Right?
No.
Politics, religion, money. Stay well clear.
And many of our guests often are still sort of very much active in a situation where they require government funding or work within a government department. So it's often there is maybe a suggestion in some of the things they say about some of the things they feel. In your case, it's slightly different because you are a paid up member of the Labour Party.
I am.
And an active volunteer. So I was interested to sort of find out a little bit about how that's influenced your thinking around volunteer management and how what in practice that actually means being a volunteer in a political party at the minute.
Yeah. So let me say it's a relatively recent thing.
Okay.
So I joined the Labour Party earlier on this year. I live in Grantham in Lincolnshire, which is part of the Grantham and Stamford constituency. It's, I believe, one of the 60 safest Conservative seats in the country. It has had a Conservative-controlled council for as long as I've been alive, until May the 4th local elections this year.
Wow.
So it's definitely fighting, I wouldn't say lost cause.
An uphill battle.
Yes, I'm definitely tilting at windmills, as part of a relatively small team of people who think the world could be a better place under Labour. And I would say I'm not one of those people who thinks everything that one political party stands for is perfect. Yeah. Everybody's got faults.
Of course.
I think where it connects me in is it's definitely that cause motivation. There is a real kind of social justice, frustration, anger with where we are as a country, and
I don't think you'd be alone in that feeling at the moment.
And a sense of hopelessness, and for a lot of people, despair. I mean, reading this morning about not just from the BBC, but reading this morning about a head teacher in a primary school where one of the girls fell over in the playground and ripped her tights and was bawling her eyes out because she was terrified of having to go back to her mum and telling her that she needed to buy new tights because her mum just couldn't afford that, and the school having to buy tights for her. You know, and boys falling over in the playground and ripping holes in their trousers. The fact that we, as the economy in the country that we are at that point, for whatever reason, and we could talk forever about the reasons why we're there, we won't, because it's not a political podcast.
No.
So that's part of that's a big part coming back into the volunteer management, is its cause. I think this is something that we've got a chance to do something about.
You can influence some change.
Now, I would say I have in the past been a member of the Liberal Democrats.
Okay.
And there are two reasons why I'm not a member of the Liberal Democrats anymore. And they have been a client, so I'm definitely not getting any more work as a consequence of this. One of them is because I don't think they stand any realistic chance of forming a future government.
Okay.
Interesting.
I left political list.
I feel like this is very honest.
Yeah, no. I left the Liberal Democrats like a lot of people did over the tuition fees issue.
Yeah.
I genuinely don't think there would have to be some kind of electoral
upheaval,
earthquake.
Yeah, which I think may be coming
to have a third party take control.
Yeah,
like absolute control.
I think I agree, and we're going to find a situation where I think strategic voting is going to kick in this time round because people are pretty sick.
And I don't think, and I'm not going to comment on that from a Labour Party perspective because they're throwing out people who've been in the party for 40 years on that one. So I think Labour has got a more realistic chance next time round. I could well be proven wrong. I might not be. So there's definitely something about that. But the other one, which is the more practical one in regard to what we're talking about, is their volunteer management sucked.
Oh, really? Okay. For Liberals.
For the Liberal Democrats. Okay. So that may be because if Labour is an outside chance where I live, Liberal Democrats are even further of an outside chance politically.
Yeah.
But I had fired off emails to people that I had received emails from in the local party and I never got replies. I filled in skills audits. Nobody ever followed up with me. Okay. You know, the usual kind of don't tell me you desperately need volunteers and then ignore don't reply.
Yeah.
I feel like you wrote a 200-word
Probably.
Tuesday of poor communication. That's
now you see where I get my influences from, Emma. I'll be doing a 200-word Tuesday on working in a podcasting studio at some point. No. In contrast, when I joined the Labour Party, I was put in touch with people. I was invited to meetings. There was a whole bunch of online learning resources that were made available to me. And I think if we go back, it's a very long-winded way of going back to.
That's fine.
If people are cause motivated and they sign up to volunteer for a cause motivation, then we have to recognise that and we have to hit that cause motivation straight away. And that's how can we give you something to do? How can we get you involved? How can we get you to meet people who are like-minded and are interested in this? How can we give you the resources and the tools and the information to do something with that passion? It may ultimately be fruitless. You may not bring about the change that you think you want to see, but at least we're harnessing that passion and that enthusiasm. And that's different from having a volunteer manual and a training policy.
Of course
it's about how it feels to people.
It's the engagement piece that you were talking about before.
Well, and it's the movement, isn't it? Like you can actually create a movement when you tap into that well. I know certainly in netball, female health and kind of women and girls is a big agenda for us, and we've just launched Netball Her. Sorry for bringing it to netball, Chris.
That's okay.
I can't help but talk about it. But Netball Her is really about the different life stages and more visibility and understanding through our partnership with the Well of, being able to talk about periods and not feel like embarrassed about it and that side of things, and having menopause policies in work and that side of things. And it's been really powerful seeing when we've tapped into that with women and girls and, men who've got daughters who want to champion it as well. Definitely it can be really, really powerful.
And I think it's interesting as well when you think about something like political volunteering, it being cause driven, and you look at what's happened on the right of the political spectrum and how they've created almost rabid anger, and that's what they've used to charge up their base. And you're thinking, okay, well, can we take some of those lessons and use some of that stuff to there is something in there around how you can activate people emotionally, because deciding to volunteer is an emotional choice. Certainly if it's cause driven, often how do we speak to those emotions? It's not about process, although that's got to be important because it's got to be there, but how do we speak to that emotional side of the brain that makes you go, okay, I'm going to do something about that?
Well, you got to help people feel stuff, haven't you? And I think that's really important.
It's also about local connection as well. And the more we think about it, there's definitely a series of blog posts in here about the parallels between the political world and the volunteering world. But volunteering is inherently a local activity. You volunteer to do something for your community.
Yes.
It may be that you want to help your community with its cancer support or whatever else, but it's generally tied to a local activity. And I think that's the case on the volunteering that I do where I am. It's about, I was talking to Chris earlier and saying that one of the guys that stood in the ward where I live in the local elections was blown away that he only missed out on election by 34 votes. And his experience was that actually he was the first candidate ever, let alone elected councillor, who came and spoke to people and said, "What are you interested in? What are the issues for you?" And I think we, on the political side, we miss a big trick in this country. We've kind of pushed local government so far down that turnout's terrible. People don't see it as important. People don't see it as relevant.
Certain seats are so established as well that it's almost
and we've become
it's taken for granted.
We've become almost kind of presidential in the way that we think about elections, because it's next time round it'll all be about, do you want Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer? Even though most people don't live in Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer's constituencies and vote their local MP. And I think there's a danger that we do the same when it comes to volunteering, that it's about this big thing. It's not about the difference that you make in your local community. And that local community connection is really vital.
That kind of brings me on nicely to my next question, which is, it looks likely that Labour, unless they throw away this ridiculous lead they've got in the polls...
Which is possible.
Which is definitely possible, because they certainly haven't capitalised either as well as they maybe should have. But Keir Starmer wins the next election. He wins it, and he has a majority in Parliament, so he's not sharing power with the Libs, with the Lib Dems. What difference do we see in volunteering? What difference do we see in volunteer management? What do you want to see Keir Starmer's government do in that first term in office that can make a difference? Because we talked before the podcast about some of the problems we've seen over the last few years. What does Labour offer in the next government that we've not seen? What's the changes we'd like to see?
Honestly, don't know, because we're not at a point of having a manifesto.
No.
And I think people far more knowledgeable and experienced and senior in the party than me need to make some of those decisions. I would say two things on that. First of all, I think it's quite a sad state of affairs that whatever any of the political parties will say in the election manifesto, volunteering and the voluntary sector will feature incredibly low down, if it features at all. NCVO and Akivo are doing some good work at the moment to try and get a manifesto put together. I did a 200-word Tuesday post recently asking people to post ideas for things to go in the manifesto, which got almost no response.
Oh, really?
I think it's that thing of maybe people don't want to be kind of like, I'm so and so from such and such an organisation, and I'd like somebody to do this.
Okay.
So, and I say it's quite sad because I'm old enough and long enough in the tooth in the sector to remember the days when we had a compact and we had, cabinet level representation from the sector for the sector and all of those kinds of things. So I think that's quite sad. I think nobody should be under any illusion that whoever wins the next election, there isn't going to be a Theresa May style magic money tree that's found with loads of cash.
Okay.
So I can't see anybody in central government, whether it's a majority, a minority, a coalition. I don't think people are going to shower the voluntary sector with money. I just don't think that's going to happen. Because, Liam Byrne famously wrote that letter when Labour left office in 2010 that said, "Dear successor, there's no money left." Well, there is absolutely no money left anymore. Yeah. I think what would be great would be, and again, to pick up some of the themes to do with the vision, for example, is there's a theme in the vision for volunteering around much more public awareness about volunteering, much more, the kind of buzz around volunteering that we felt after the 2012 Olympic and Paralympics, the kind of buzz that we felt, which was about the only good thing coming out of the first lockdown, about that community spirit. And I think there's a narrative that they can play out, our elected officials can play out at local government and national government, and indeed in the devolved administrations around the UK around that. There are changes that we could look at around, like the stuff we were talking about, moving to a well-being economy. Yeah. And how do we look at well-being as a kind of key measure of our success rather than just about the economic stuff? There is a recognition whoever gets elected is going to have to engage in the climate agenda. And that climate agenda is largely being driven by volunteers. Yep. It is not paid staff that invaded Centre Court or wherever it was at Wimbledon today as we're recording this for Just Stop Oil. Yep. It is not paid staff walking down London streets holding traffic. It's not paid staff gluing themselves to the road. Nobody gets paid to start a revolution. It's volunteers
I like that one.
making that. I'd love to say it was original. It was a Susan Ellis classic. And she always used to say, if we waited for paid staff to make change, women in this country would still be waiting for the right to vote.
Of course.
Now we're in Manchester, so that's a good place to talk about suffragette movement. Yeah. And you can argue till the cows come home where they volunteers. The reality is they weren't being paid. They were doing something they were passionate about, and it was for the benefit of the wider community.
Very
in
much
my book,
cause-driven.
That's volunteers.
Yeah.
So I think any future government, if we can recognise that and we can talk that up, that helps with that awareness piece. I'd love to say that any future government's going to make a change up style noughties investment in local volunteering infrastructure. Ain't going to happen.
No.
But I think that's why the awareness is also partnered with the appreciation. Yeah. It's not only the appreciation of people giving their time as volunteering, it's the appreciation of the impact of that time.
Absolutely.
And I think that moves us quite nicely onto data and kind of trends and insight. We know that Sport England released their Active Lives survey, which talks about the participation in sport, but also the impact of volunteers, as well as NCVO recently released Time Well Spent, and kind of the volunteer experience. As someone who's been across this sort of type of data for your 29 years, year in, year out.
Too much data sometimes.
It seems that the needle's kind of a bit stubborn to shift, and we've got the vision for volunteering. Like, how do we get it to kind of move in the right direction, and what do the latest results kind of tell us around the state of the sector at the moment?
Okay. Yeah, and data I can be upset. There is a famous story in my family. It was around writing funding bids and me waking up in the middle of the night one night. Well, I didn't even wake up. I just sat bolt upright in bed and went, no more spreadsheets. So it gets used quite a lot in my family about my inner data geek. I think we're sat in a position that's almost unique in my 29 years in the field in terms of the richness of the data that we've got. So in England, at least, because volunteering is a devolved responsibility for anybody listening who doesn't realise that across the UK, in England, at least, we have a community life survey that gives us 22 years worth of data. That data since 2013 has pretty consistently showed a slowing in the rate of volunteer participation. In line with what we've seen in the States and Australia and others as well. More recently, we've got data from that survey from the year before COVID hit. We've then got the 2021 data, which was from April 2020 to March 21, so when our principal 3 main national lockdowns in England happened.
Yep.
And then we've got the data from 21-22, which was, I think, October 21, September 22, something like that, which all the restrictions were lifted in February 22. So half of that, at least, is kind of post-COVID restrictions.
Yep.
So we've got data about levels of volunteering. Then we've got time well spent from 2019, which tells us about what people's volunteer experience, good and bad, was.
Yep.
And then, as you said, Imo, we've just in the last couple of weeks had 2023, which tells us about what people's experience is post-COVID. So that gives us, and you've got then things like the Sport England stuff and the New British Heart Foundation report, all of which provide kind of sectoral, subsectoral insights
Context,
into this. Context to this. So we've got loads of information. And what does that information tell us? Volunteering was declining before the pandemic. It really declined during the pandemic for obvious reasons.
Yep.
It doesn't seem to have picked back up again. Now, that same period, as I say, covered part of lockdowns. It also covered the beginning of cost of living crisis. So we probably need another year or two's worth of data to conclusively say that we're either continuing another downward trend or it's not going to get reversed. The big worry for me from the most recent set of Community Life Survey data, which came out was end of January time, was that informal volunteering, which everybody talked about at the end of the first lockdown. There was all this Together Coalition work, and it talked about 8.3 million people who would be interested in volunteering again in the future informally. Informal volunteering rates have tanked post-COVID. And part of the reason why I don't like that July 2020 data being quoted is it's quite a unique snapshot. July 2020... We were mostly furloughed. We were mostly sat at home in our pants watching Netflix because there was nothing else.
For yourself, Rob.
Nothing else that we could do.
It's like you sat there watching me.
That's a very different. I've just given everybody a mental image of Chris that they didn't want. Podcasting is not a visual medium.
It is now.
Good job on video, this one, right?
That's a very different world from where we are now. In fact, Pro Bono Economics found there were 6 million fewer volunteers in the second lockdown than the first one.
That in itself is interesting as a stat.
So we've got this kind of decline. We also know that whilst 92% of volunteers are happy with their experience, according to time well spent, that's 4% down from pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
We know that people are telling the research, and this is 7,000 people, so more, far more than
adults
you need for a national.
Well. Yeah, it does look at adults.
Yeah. 16 plus, indeed, because nobody under the age of 16 volunteers, so we should never bother surveying them. New Zealand count it from 10 and up, which is a much better way of doing it. But it tells us that people think volunteering is becoming too much like paid work. Increasing numbers are saying it's too much like paid work. There's this really interesting thing in there that people who don't volunteer say that what puts them off is concern about a lack of flexibility. But then 82% of people who do volunteer say that their volunteering's flexible. So there's a perception, there's an image issue around that as well. That people are saying they're less likely to volunteer, that people, particularly young people, are concerned about being out of pocket. And, we're all having to cut back financially. Organisations are no exception. But if we don't offer the reimbursement of volunteer expenses, we erect a massive barrier to people volunteering. And we go completely contrary to all the public statements we make about how important equality, diversity and inclusion is.
Of course.
Which is just like the worst form of hypocrisy from a social justice sector.
Yeah.
So we're in a position where I wrote a blog post about this recently. It feels like everything's a bit doom and gloom at the moment.
The headwinds are not. They're not easing off.
No, the indications are not positive, and we do things. We've had 3 Commonwealth Games this century already. We've had an Olympic and Paralympic Games. They haven't really moved the needle on volunteering. My better angels would say it was a wonderful thing that apparently 7 million people volunteered for the big help out. That's great, and that's wonderful if that proves to be accurate. It's a much smaller sample size than we would normally look at. Anecdotally, I'm hearing from organisations, and we are only a couple of months on from that as we record this, that isn't really flowing through into any more volunteering.
Yeah.
So I think what it's pointing to is, and I would say that none of the changes that we've seen have been stuff that we weren't expecting. We knew that the older generation were going to scale their volunteering back eventually because we don't live forever. We just never expected it was going to happen overnight on the 23rd of March when COVID restrictions came in 2020. So I think for me, there was this brilliant quote from Ruchir Sharma in the States. I can't remember who they work for. It was one of the big banks. It said, crises rarely change anything. They simply accelerate what was already changing. And I think that's happened. And what it feels like to me is there's a nettle to be grasped by way of change. We're not going to solve recruitment problems by doing more of what we've always done. There's some fundamental change that needs to happen. Cuts back to our talk earlier about volunteer engagement professionals and senior leaders being brought in, changes in attitude. There's something that needs to change. We've got the tools. We've got a great vision for volunteering. We've got in Scotland a really great action plan for volunteering, which importantly picks up the role of funders, which the Vision for Volunteering England doesn't. We've got all the data that we need to point, data that says the kind of stuff that people and I have been saying for 10, 15, 20 years. The question now is what we do about it. And what we do about it, do we do it as individual organisations to try and fix our own problems, or do we do it collaboratively as a sector, recognising that this is a problem for all of us that we need to solve, and it's a solution that creates a renewable resource of volunteer time long into the future.
And it's funny you mentioned Big Help Out, because I know how much you two love talking about campaigns. So we'll come on to that in a minute. But I did just want to pick up on your informal volunteering point. And so we, through the adversity of the pandemic, had to think really innovatively to kind of like manage and navigate that. And I just wonder, coming out of COVID, how well do you think the structure, infrastructure and operating system is of organisations in encouraging informal volunteering? And actually, is that a result of the decline, or is it the motivations of the people?
I think it's the infrastructure. I think it was really interesting seeing the good and the bad of the speed of change that happened when we went into lockdown. So I don't think we've really taken the opportunity as a volunteer management engagement community, or indeed as a sector, to properly recognise and celebrate the amount of innovation that happened at rapid pace and rapid scale out of necessity. And, you know, I applaud everybody who was able to do that. I don't think the infrastructure's changed to adapt to that. I think we changed out of necessity, and then anecdotally, again, what I heard from a lot of organisations was the moment everything started opening up again, we went back to DBS checking anything with a heartbeat. We went back to volunteers are inherently a risky proposition, despite the fact that without volunteers, the death toll would have been a lot higher. I mean, you look at what happened with NHS volunteer responders. Just on that, I applied within 24 hours of that launching. Name, address, telephone number, email, scan of passport. You're approved within 24 hours to do stuff that 6 weeks previously would have probably taken you 2 months to be vetted to do. At least. And then we've gone back because it's kind of default to risky volunteers. So I don't think the infrastructure's there. And I'll be controversial.
Thank you. That's what I've been waiting for.
I'll be controversial.
Sitting there waiting patiently.
Let him talk long enough.
I think some organisations and and I'll include myself in this, in the sector, need to apologise to volunteers for what happened during that first lockdown. Because whilst it was done for, I'm not saying I'm not saying people should have changed the way they did it. But because of the unique circumstances, volunteers were stood down very quickly. Organisations then furloughed their volunteer managers. And that for some organisations meant that sometimes elderly, but not always, isolated individuals had the one thing that mattered to them, that they got up in the morning for, volunteering, taken away from them. and then the person that they connected to that organisation from taken away from them as well. And if I was in that position, with everything that was going on in that first lockdown and the fear that everybody had, I would feel betrayed, I would feel abandoned, I would feel that within 24 hours I'd gone from being told we can't do our work without you to you're out there on your own and you've got to live with this on your own and we're not here for you anymore.
And you're not going back to that organisation thereafter.
And you're not. You're not going back to that organisation, but also you're probably going to question whether you even want to go back to volunteering. And again, I'm not saying that organisations were wrong to do that. You know, they were very unique circumstances. People had to look after their paid staff, they had to look after their budgets, they had to look after... But if we're honest, we need to apologise to some people for the way that we did. I had a brilliant article on my blog. It was brilliant because I didn't write it. In the autumn of 2020, from a hospice volunteer manager who kept every single volunteer going in the clinical team through the worst of COVID.
There is some good stories from that period.
Right through the worst of it.
But they are more the exceptions than the rule.
Yeah. And that was about risk. That was about understanding that these were, they weren't more risky because they were volunteers. These were intelligent people who'd done the right job of recruiting them. We'd trained them. That wasn't going to work in every organisation. But I think until introspectively we look at both the really good things that we did in there and the really bad things, if you want to phrase it that way, that we did in that period. If we don't look back, we won't learn from it and we won't try and solve those problems again in the future.
So shifting, you mentioned the NHS responders. I mean, I want to lighten the mood, but I don't know whether this is going to lighten the mood.
Probably
we'll see where it goes. So NHS responders, and then more recently we talked a little bit about the big help out, 7 million people. Currently, from my awareness, there is no end date at the moment on the big help out. It's there as an app
over the summer,
you can kind of engage with it. And there was a lot of excitement and interest. But we don't always see, as you talked about, kind of like from Olympic, Paralympic legacies in the decade and that side of things, the translation into the more tangible benefits to the sector. So what are the positive things that will translate it and kind of sustain it and help it grow in the good way we want it to?
Okay. So one is about learning and reflection and understanding. NHS volunteer responders, NHS volunteer and care responders as they are now do fantastic work. Again, really, really unique circumstances. I don't think we've done enough of celebrating 750,000 people came forward to help with that initiative in less than a week. That's, again, exceptional circumstances, but that's a brilliant thing. And the fact that RVS were able to get that infrastructure up and running and going as quickly as they did, and indeed lots of local organisations did it in their own ways, mutual aid groups, etc. as well. Fantastic thing. I don't think we've learned all the lessons that we could do from that. So about half of those volunteers were never given anything to do for very good reasons. Health and social care, local public services were desperately playing catch up. It wasn't their priority to populate Good Sam with opportunities. It was their priority to save lives at the time. But we mobilised hundreds of thousands of people and never gave them anything to do. And there was a real learning opportunity from that for all of us to go, what do those people think about volunteering? How can we do that? That window's gone now. So I've banged that drum enough. We've not learned from that. Where I think we can learn from it is through, again, that connection to local. So where the mutual aid groups worked really, really well was when they connected in with local infrastructure. And there was a lot of kind of, it should be local, it shouldn't be national and top down and driven by that. Where it's worked really well is where the combination between that local and that national infrastructure has worked. What we have witnessed over 13 years in England compared to the other three home nations is the dismantling of our local infrastructure for volunteering. CVS, volunteer centres, as a consequence of austerity. If you're in local government and you're faced with, do I empty the bins? Do I provide a social care service? Do I provide a volunteer centre? You empty the bins and you provide the social care service. We desperately need to get some form of local infrastructure back to create that lasting future. And local infrastructure, I was responsible for local infrastructure for 6 years at Volunteering, and it's not sexy. Funders don't want to fund it. You can see people's eyes glaze over when you talk about infrastructure in the voluntary sector. It's not popular or anything like that. But without it, what it is it's relationships.
Yeah.
It's community, it's connection. It's not an office with a volunteer centre logo on it. It's somebody in the community who, when you come forward and you say, I need to do this, they go, oh yeah, that person, and that person.
It's the step from informal to formal.
Point. Yeah.
For me, that's the people that help that step, help organisations take that step.
And I think that is the key point. I think it's really interesting. I'd be really interested to know, from talking to people involved in Big Help Out, how they found it engaging with the local infrastructure in England when it's so disjointed and so threadbare. I'd be really interested in finding out from them what they thought. 20 years ago, Do It was a national volunteer database. If there was a volunteer opportunity through a local volunteer centre, it was on Do It.
Yep.
It's fragmented across dozens of systems now. So there is no kind of one... I'm not saying there should be one platform, but there isn't one... a fundamental infrastructure.
You've made the market more complicated for the end user, which we think is a terrible thing,
Well, but it's funny because my brain's looped us back now to where we started in the conversation in regards to the volunteer management or volunteer engagement professionals as a pathway, and actually is the problem the digital platform that's not connecting everything, or is the challenge that actually we need to have a better infrastructure of nurturing people about volunteer engagement?
Both of them things.
Both.
So they can recruit, retain, support, transition.
What the digital should do is make that other stuff easier.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not about technology as the... I love my tech. It's not...
Quite good at it.
It is not about technology being the solution. It's technology enabling.
Facilitation, enabling.
I mean, there's all this talk at the moment about AI, and AI is going to destroy the world. You just need to spend 5 minutes on ChatGPT to realise how far away we are from AI destroying the world. It can barely provide a coherent sentence.
Give us another 2 years, we're okay.
No, but you said there, it's the tech and it's the relationships. But those are the people element.
Yeah.
And then the kind of... exactly. And I think it's how do we kind of...
Well...
do that.
I mean, we did have, me and Rob went for lunch before the podcast, and we talked about some of these things in advance. For me, there's a gap in the leadership in the sector at the moment, which may help address some of these things. Again, I'm not suggesting it's a top-down fix, but there is a gap somewhere in the leadership, in the strategic direction, and the pulling together of these organisations to form a more powerful single voice that speaks effectively on behalf of some of these bigger challenges, because these challenges are bigger than any one organisation. And I guess, speaking to that, Rob, what's your thoughts around that space?
I would agree. I think there is that kind of gap in leadership, and I think the danger is in the kind of economic context that we're in. There is an understandable need to kind of look after your own and look after your organisation and do all of that. I don't know where that leadership would come from, though. I know it shouldn't be, an independent consultant. It needs to be, in Scotland you've got Volunteer Scotland, in Northern Ireland you've got Volunteer Now. You've got a distinct organisation speaking up for volunteering. You've got that in Australia. You've got it in New Zealand. Wales, England, we're kind of voluntary sector and volunteering all part of one, which is, NCVO and WCVA do absolutely fantastic work. But where's that platform? In the past, we had the NIVEA group, we had the England Volunteering Development Council, we had these bodies where politicians, funders, kind of interested parties would engage, where we could convene people and have these conversations. I think moving stuff online hasn't helped. I mean, there's loads of advantages to having online, but
it fragments.
I know there are colleagues of mine on the Heritage Volunteering Group who, if they listen to this, will go, here he is banging on again about everything being online.
Archives are online as well.
Yeah, I know. But and I do online podcasts and training. But there is something that is materially different about being in a room with people.
Of course.
I went to Inside Government Volunteer Management Conference at the end of January this year, and there were about, I would reckon, 150, 200 volunteer managers in the room. And it was the usual thing that where the real richness and value came was you're chatting to some random person you've never met before in a queue for the toilet or for coffee or for lunch. And that's where those conversations happen. That's where those networks are built. That's where that exchange of ideas, and you're doing this and I'm doing. Whereas what we do now is we do our conference on Zoom, and it gets to the coffee break and everybody turns their cameras off, mutes themselves and goes into their kitchen.
Yeah.
That conference, by the way, sounds terrible. You queued up everywhere.
200 people in a small space. But equally, if you decide, I mean, AVM have been very good with their conference of saying we're going to do a networking thing afterwards in the afternoon.
I think they'll admit themselves it wasn't as successful as it would
You
look
get
like
a
it to have been.
fraction of the people.
And it's the usual faces.
You get a
and,
fraction of the people.
The usual people that you would see at these things are the people that you would have mentioned to be on that event. It's
Absolutely.
not the new people or the people that are a little bit unsure or
I'm
less
very
confident.
I'm very mindful as somebody with a name and hopefully a positive reputation and the length of experience that I've got, that there is a danger that voices like mine can crowd out the new and the innovative and the creative, and it's how do we find a space for those to be heard and that diversity of ideas. Carl Wilding, who I mentioned earlier, used to be the chief exec at NCVO, did a brilliant thing at Heritage Volunteering Group Conference years ago where he'd gone through the delegate list beforehand. So it's a room full of people who manage volunteers in Heritage. And he said, I may get the name wrong, but he went something along the lines of, do you realise there are more people in this room called Alison than there are from a black Asian minority background? Which speaks volumes if those voices and faces aren't represented in volunteer management. They're not going to help those voices and faces be represented in volunteering. So I think we've got to find a way to create that conversation, have that dialogue that people can participate in, and it's cost effective and it's time effective, which is a great thing of online, but has the richness of the in-person with it as well.
It's a challenge. It is a real challenge. It is a real challenge. And again, that's where the local infrastructure can do that. And but it's many, many small parts that make up that big whole. And again, that's where that leadership piece comes from me, to create a situation where that can happen. And at the minute, it feels it's a little bit, I've used the word a couple of times today, fragmented. And that's it feels like there could be something more.
It's also, do we see, that goes back to your point from much earlier, Emma, about do we see this as a profession?
Yes.
If this is just a job, which, let's be honest, it is for some people, this is all I know. I have no plan B to fall back on. I dropped out of university, and there aren't many jobs in physics and acoustics
2 years
anyway.
Of acoustics,
not very well though. I'm passionate about this. This is my vocation. This is what I know. This is, I'm fortunate enough to do something that I love and make money from it as well. Not a lot of money, but I make money. Anybody out there who thinks of becoming a consultant, believe me, it is not the route to untold riches. That some people will tell you it is. But if you're doing it to get on and get a job in the sector, if you're doing it because it's something that you love, but you're not really interested in that bigger picture thing, then you're not going to feel that need to be part of that debate.
And that comes again forward. What you were saying before about volunteer managers versus people that manage volunteers.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And how do we give the space? A lot of people I've heard from in the last year have said, do you know what, I'd love to go back to face-to-face conferences, but I've got no travel budget and I've got no L&D budget left anymore. How daft are we in our sector where we are never going to compete with the private sector on money and salary to strip out L&D budgets? Because L&D is about the only thing that we can offer that is going to be really, really meaningful. We're not talking about private healthcare. We're not talking about company cars. We're not talking about gym membership. Any of those things that you would get with a salary 3 times the amount. And what we do is we take all of that L&D stuff away because we're a bit worried that our reserves might take a hit. I know I'm being deliberately facetious.
Well, no, I know, but I didn't mean I know, but I was going to say, I guess it's where you talked about digital being the enabler. L&D is the enabler for people to be more inclusive, to understand what they're not consciously aware of, to create that sense of belonging. And I guess there's I definitely think that volunteering and learning and development come hand in hand, because you know that a lot of individuals will volunteer to grow in an experience because they want to learn something new in a supportive way, or impart really great knowledge that they have, mentoring others in an area that they want, you know, that they're passionate about. So, yeah, I mean, that's another podcast, right?
Yeah, it definitely is.
We are going to be here till midnight.
Well, I was going to say,
well, move through the list,
I think
right?
I've lost where we are on our list of questions.
Well, yeah, but
So we are just over 12 months into the Vision for Volunteering. It was launched with some fanfare, and you know, we I think the last time we saw each other in person was at that particular event.
Yeah.
You know, what are your thoughts 12 months in?
What are my thoughts 12 months in? I think the Vision for Volunteering is brilliant. It's aspirational. It's energising. I think when it launched, I was really struck by how many volunteer engagement professionals went, this is fantastic. I can restructure my volunteer strategy or write my new volunteer strategy around these. I think there's so much in there that everybody would agree with and engage with. I think it lost a lot of momentum because it launched on May the 6th, 2020. Yep. We're now on July the 5th, 2020. No, May the 6th, 2022. It launched.
Yes, I was going to say, yeah.
We're now on 5th of July as we record this, 2023. So it's not a 10-year vision anymore. It's a less than 9-year vision. Yep. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to be really mindful of that. The clock is ticking. Yep. We have a wonderful team of people. The 3 people led by Laura Lowther at NCVO are doing fantastic work, raising awareness of that vision, really pushing that vision forward. And we've been to some of the events that they've done, and it's both amazing and also slightly worrying to see the number of people who didn't know anything about the vision. But that for me is a good thing, because we're connecting with a broader audience, which is exactly what we want to do. I think, go back to the point earlier about leadership, I think the fact that we've got a collaboration of Sport England, NAVCA, Association of Volunteer Managers, NCVO and others, pulling all of that together is brilliant, because that, again, collaborative relationship, more than one organisation can do. I'm, again, old enough and long enough in the tooth to remember when we had the Commission on the Future of Volunteering in 2008, which did a very, very similar exercise. And very similarly was unfunded in terms of its implementation. And it was hampered by a change of government 2 years later. There's a worrying parallel there that the vision could have a change of government 2 years later. But I think it's separate enough from politics this time round.
With it being generally unfunded as well, it's probably less.
I don't know. I would hope that by 2032, most of what that vision set out to do is achieved. I'm quite optimistic about that. I'm quite positive, and I would love to do whatever I can and work with whoever I can to try and help make that happen. I don't think we'll get there. I think time's ticking too quickly. When the dark days that we're in at the moment, economically, etc., are not going away anytime soon. I think the pressures on organisations are going to be significant, and I think we'll probably need to get to a point 4 to 5 years out where we really hone in on maybe the stuff around EDI, maybe some of the stuff around power and changing power structures within organisations to make that work. And that's not a bad thing. If we manage 2 or 3 of those 5, I think some of the stuff is beyond our control, like a societal change where everybody suddenly recognises the value of volunteers, and
the
our
aspirational
society
stuff
runs
very
on
nature. Aspirational.
That whenever we talk about volunteers in the NHS, people don't immediately talk job substitution. We're recording this on the 75th anniversary of the NHS. Volunteers have been involved since day one of the NHS. It's not a bad thing. It's not a new thing. So there's all that kind of stuff that I think might be a bit outside of our control. We've tried it before. We've not kind of really got there with it. But I'm confident that some of it will happen. Some of it has to happen. All the informal stuff is about changing power structures. If we're in a much more diverse society, if we don't address some of these EDI issues, the
very nature of the collaboration on it should, as we talked a bit earlier about the leadership, it gives an opportunity for these relatively disparate organisations to pull together on a single voice for the sector. To
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
There's some optimism in here.
There is absolutely
You two got to be the
optimism.
light, right? Because we've got a bit of darkness.
Yeah. Well, and I go back to, even with all the darkness that's going on at the moment, I go back to that point earlier about this is where creativity, this is where innovation happens.
Necessity drives it.
You go back to one of the organisations I worked for in the past, Bernardo's. Thomas Bernardo was an Irish missionary on his way out to India or the Far East or somewhere like that. And he saw for himself the darkness of what young people were going through in the East End of London at the time, and started that organisation. It was through that awful experience that those young people were having that an organisation exists now. Like every organisation isn't perfect, but has transformed lives of young people for the better for decades. And, you know, I think all of our organisations have been born out of a similar kind of experience to that. If you're a charity,
I always have a funny, such a funny paradox situation that we've got to get things have got to get so bad again before we have to sort of, you know, it speaks so poorly of the political classes that we kind of have to do it ourselves and set these organisations up and make the difference for your own communities. But that's kind of fundamentally, that's kind of what volunteering has been based on since day dot. It's
absolutely.
Well, it's what inspires the change in you. What inspires you to take action to make something different.
And we do live in we're very fortunate with, you know, the NHS and the public services that we've had. We do live in a society now where we expect somebody else to do it for us.
Yep.
And that's not a bad thing. But I think also more and more of us are realising that sometimes you actually have to do it yourself. If you want that local park built for the kids in your neighbourhood,
well, I think
you've got to agitate and campaign for it.
I think you do see with certainly, you know, I'm of an age now where I'm seeing more of the younger generation, and I'm no longer considered to be in that generation so much. But you do get that sense of you know, the consumerism element. We have been consumers for such a long time. But you see with a lot of younger people, they are more engaged and cause aware. You know, and maybe not the whole not all of but there's certainly a highly charged group within that sort of, you know, and you see that's one of the positive things out of some of the figures I've seen is there has been an increase in young people volunteering.
Absolutely.
So
and none of this is new as well. I mean, I always joke, Tony Blair, I think in his second term in office, had an aspiration of 1 million more people volunteering.
I think that was in Iraq, though. So.
And the Iraq connection is he could have hit that target on one day when everybody marched through London about going into Iraq in 2003. But those weren't the kind of volunteers that he wanted.
No.
So you know, I think there's there's that agency. How do we give people that sense of agency to really make change happen rather than sitting back and waiting for somebody else to do it for them?
Well, that's a perfect segue into the little conference that you and Chris are working on with TeamKinetic for this year, and the topic is changing the world of work and its impact on volunteering. Now, we don't want to ruin it because you want to have the element of surprise for those that
because I haven't written the presentation yet, Imo. So.
That's all right. So you've got a bit of time there. But can you sort of share a brief, because we've been about 3 hours, I think, on this podcast, introduce some of the themes that you might be discussing and give us a little bit of a flavour of what people could look forward to around the future challenges and how we're going to change the world.
So we talked a lot about volunteering and the pandemic over the course of the conversation so far today. Obviously, the world of work's changed in the pandemic. Flexible working, home-based working, 4-day week, universal basic income trials, all AI and what that could do for the way that we all work. So what I'm quite keen to do is pull something together, because it's an area that I've just been interested in, I've been reading loads and loads about over the last few months, is try and bring something into land for volunteer engagement professionals. What does this mean for us? What's the potential? Let's just take 4-day week. What's the potential of suddenly lots of people having a 3-day weekend for volunteering? What does that mean for us? What are their priorities on that extra day off, and how do we compete with those other things they could do with their spare time?
Or
leisure?
Or complement.
Where does volunteering sit within that leisure piece?
Absolutely. Look at universal basic income. So if we're all paid £1,600, for most people, that's not enough to live on. You still have to go out and do something.
Yep.
But it potentially allows people, some of the studies that have been done in Scandinavia, to have the financial security to start their own businesses, which they wouldn't have done in the past. Well, if you run your own business, there's a flexibility that comes with that because you're your own boss that then makes it potentially easier to volunteer. AI, if that's going to free up loads of our time because we're not going to have to write 100-page boring PowerPoint presentations anymore, ChatGPT will do it for us. What does that mean for the time that we have available? Equally, if we're a volunteer manager who puts our professional status and credibility into doing the admin side of our job, and within 2 years, Microsoft Copilot can do that for us.
Yeah.
We're already working on that.
What does that mean for us as a profession? Go back to competencies. It means that interpersonal, that human connection bit becomes far more important. So I'm not going to have the answers because I've got to write it in August. I'm not going to have the answers by the 27th of September. But what I want to do is try and get people to think about this kind of stuff and start engaging with this kind of stuff, because it's coming down the line. AI is already transforming the way that people do work. We're not going to be immune to this in the charity sector. How do we think about it now so that we're in a position to adapt?
If people would like to save the date for the conference, it's going to be the 27th of September. You'll be able to visit the TeamKinetic website to book your tickets, and if you're already a TeamKinetic user, you'll be able to do it within your own app. We can't wait to see you all at the event.
It's very good. So we're kind of bringing it to a close now. We've talked competencies, professional pathways. We've talked celebrated Rob's anniversary of work and journey, a little bit of politics, leadership, data, campaigns, vision for volunteering. So you've had quite a lot.
I think it's the broadest
rich,
of time. I had a feeling this one maybe that
definitely.
podcast.
And definitely, if anyone decides they really liked a bit and they want to give you some feedback, and you could come back, you could hone in on a different area. So there is one thing that we like to finish on. It's a little thing that Chris and I do, and it's called Two From You.
Okay.
And that is where we'd love you to share one word from your professional work within volunteering, and then one word from your personal world as a volunteer that you feel sum up life in volunteering.
Okay. So the professional word would have to be flexibility.
Nice.
Which I think is probably the most used word in the new Time Well Spent report. I haven't gone through and analysed it. Amy and Ray, who wrote it, might be able to tell me differently.
You get a sense of that.
Yeah.
Put it through ChatGPT.
No, I haven't put it through ChatGPT yet. And from the personal one, I think relate back to what I was saying about the reason why I do it. It's around passion.
Nice.
It's a flexibility and passion. I think if we're designing more volunteering that is flexible and really hones in on people's passions, we're not doing a bad job.
Love
it. Love it.
Well, a massive thank you from both of us. I do listen to your Advancing the Profession. I was a little bit excited when Chris said we're going to do the podcast, so that's my fangirl moment. But yeah, thanks for agreeing to be a part of Team Talk with us. If you're listening to the conversations and it's triggered any curiosity, or as we said earlier, you'd love to explore more, definitely let me and Chris know, because we love a good conversation.
We do. We're going to be putting links into Rob's 200-word Tuesdays.
Yeah, if you use my Linktree link, it will go through to absolutely everything.
Okay.
Podcast
I was going to try and list all the things that Rob does content-wise, and realise that this isn't a Joe Rogan podcast, and we need to get home at some point for our tea tonight. So, no, massive thank you, Rob, for your time today. It's been lovely to get into all this stuff with you. It's always interesting because you have such well-formed opinions. It's a nice chat to have.
I am, as I describe myself sometimes to clients, I am a professional opinion spouter for hire.
I like that.
Amazing.
As always, if you'd like to email us, it's pod@teamkinetic.co.uk. Share your thoughts, share your ideas, give us your feedback. Any requests for future episodes? We're currently planning season 3, so hopefully you'll be hearing a little bit more from us over the next few weeks. Do subscribe, and until next time, from all of us, take care of yourselves, take care of somebody else, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.